She's stout, hard worker, good with chores.
A girl traded for 2 draft mules doesn't expect a fairy tale. She expects calluses. Dust settling on the mercantile porch marked the end of Maeve's girlhood, bought and paid for by a man whose shadow swallowed the sun. Survival was the only vow that mattered now. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. Uncle Amos didn't look her in the eye. He stared at the scratched surface of the mercantile counter, his fingers twitching toward the heavy leather pouch of coins and the deed to a matched pair of Missouri mules. Maeve stood a few feet away, her thin cotton dress offering no defense against the late October wind, bleeding through the cracks in the floorboards. She felt nauseous. A sour, sharp bile rested at the back of her throat, tasting like old tin. "She's stout," Amos muttered, though it was a lie. Maeve was 18, all sharp elbows and collarbones, her ribs visible when she breathed too deep. Hard worker, good with shorties. The man who had bought her didn't respond to the sales pitch. He didn't need to. The money was already on the counter. His name was Gideon. That was all Amos had told her when he dragged her out of bed at dawn. "Pack your satchel. Gideon Reed is taking you up the ridge." Gideon was immense. He didn't carry the soft, doughy bulk of the town merchants. He was built like the timber he lived among, dense, weathered, unyielding. He wore a coat of thick canvas lined with sheepskin, smelling fiercely of pine tar, wood smoke, and the copper tang of raw meat. His beard was dark and untrimmed, masking the lower half of a face that looked as though it had forgotten how to arrange itself into a smile. "Wagons out front," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, abrasive, like 2 stones grinding together. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply turned his broad back and walked out the door, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. Maeve looked at her uncle. Amos finally met her gaze, his eyes watery, defensive. "It's a harsh world, Maeve. Better you get a roof over your head before the snows hit. I can't feed us both." She didn't argue. Arguing was for women who had choices. Maeve picked up her canvas satchel containing 2 patched shifts, a pair of woolen stockings with a hole in the heel, and a cracked tortoiseshell comb that used to belong to her mother, and walked out into the biting wind. The wagon was a brutal, springless thing, loaded down with sacks of flour, salt, rifle cartridges, and a barrel of kerosene. Gideon was already in the driver's seat, reins in his massive, leather-gloved hands. Maeve climbed up the side, her skirt catching on a splintered board. She ripped it free, ignoring the small tear in the hem, and sat on the hard wooden plank beside him. He clicked his tongue. The draft horses lunged forward. They left the town of Red Creek behind without a single backward glance from either of them. The journey up the mountain was a steady, agonizing ascent. With every mile, the air grew thinner, sharper. The pines crowded in, their dark green needles blocking out the pale autumn sun. It was cold, a deep, sinking cold that bypassed Maeve's skin and settled directly into her marrow. She crossed her arms over her chest, pressing her hands into her armpits, clamping her jaw shut to keep her teeth from rattling. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of asking for a blanket. She wasn't entirely sure he wouldn't just throw her off the wagon if she spoke. 2 hours passed. The silence between them was dense, almost suffocating. The only sounds were the creak of the wooden wheels, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt, and the occasional snap of a dry branch. Maeve studied him from the corner of her eye. His profile was harsh, nose slightly crooked, as if it had been broken and set poorly. Eyes fixed, straight ahead. He didn't look like a man looking for a wife. He looked like a man who needed a beast of burden. The realization didn't break her heart. It galvanized something hard and ugly in her stomach. She could work. She had scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled for her uncle. She could survive a mountain man. A violent shudder racked her frame as the wind howled through a narrow gorge. Without looking at her, Gideon reached behind the seat with one hand, grabbed a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket, and tossed it into her lap. It smelled strongly of wet dog and old sweat. "Wrap up," he grunted. "Ain't hauling a frozen corpse up the ridge." "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice cracking, sounding weak and pathetic in her own ears. Don't thank me. Just don't freeze. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders, the coarse wool scratching her neck. She burrowed her freezing fingers into the fabric. The scent of the blanket was overpowering, but it held a faint, residual heat. She closed her eyes, letting the jarring motion of the wagon rattle her bones, resigning herself to the brutal isolation of the peaks above. The cabin was not a home. It was a shelter. Perched on a rocky shelf overlooking a dizzying drop into a pine-choked valley, the structure was made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and dried moss. The roof sagged slightly in the middle under the weight of accumulated dead needles. A rusted tin chimney punched through the wood, coughing out a thin, anemic trail of gray smoke. Gideon halted the wagon. He swung down, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a heavy thud. He began unhitching the horses immediately, leaving Maeve to navigate her own way down. Her legs were numb. When she hit the ground, her knees buckled, sending her staggering against the wagon wheel. The iron rim bit into her shoulder, bruising the bone. "Inside," Gideon ordered, nodding toward the heavy oak door. He hoisted a sack of flour onto his shoulder. Maeve pushed off the wheel, her stiff fingers struggling to grip her satchel. She walked toward the cabin. The porch steps groaned under her weight. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. It was a stagnant, heavy odor of rendered animal fat, unwashed linens, and stale urine. The cabin consisted of one main room and a half-loft accessible by a crude ladder. The light was dim, filtered through two small windows caked in grime. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, the fire within reduced to smoldering embers. Then she heard the rustle. It came from beneath a large, scarred wooden table in the center of the room. Maeve froze, her breath catching. A rat? A mountain lion? She squinted into the gloom. Two pairs of eyes stared back at her from the shadows. "Come out of there," a gruff voice sounded behind her. Gideon dropped the flour sack onto a bench, the impact sending a cloud of white dust into the air. The shadows beneath the table shifted. Slowly, reluctantly, two children crept out. They were twins, maybe 5 years old, a boy and a girl. They looked feral. Their faces were smeared with soot and dirt, their hair a tangled, matted mess of dark brown. They wore oversized shirts that looked like they had been fashioned from old flour sacks. Their bare, filthy feet curled against the cold floorboards. The boy stood slightly in front of the girl, his small fists clenched, glaring at Maeve with a startling, aggressive intensity. The girl peeked out from behind her brother's shoulder, her thumb wedged firmly in her mouth. "Toby." "Tess," Gideon said, his voice flat. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Maeve. "This is Maeve. She's staying. She cooks. She cleans. You listen to her." That was it. That was the entirety of the introduction. Gideon turned back to the door. "I got traps to check before dark. Woods out back, water's in the barrel. Don't let the fire die." He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the heavy silence. Maeve stood perfectly still, her knuckles white around the handle of her satchel. She was entirely alone with two wild creatures in a cabin miles from anywhere. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so intense it made her vision swim. She wanted to collapse onto the filthy floor and weep until she threw up. Instead, she dropped her satchel. The sound made Toby flinch, but he didn't back down. "Right," Maeve said, her voice shaking only a fraction. She unbuttoned her thin coat. "I need to build up that fire." She walked toward the hearth. As she passed the table, Toby lunged. His small, dirt-caked teeth clamped down hard on her wrist. Maeve shrieked, yanking her arm back. The pain was sudden and sharp. Toby let go, scurrying backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wild like a cornered fox. Maeve stared at her wrist. An angry red circle of teeth marks indented her pale skin, a single drop of blood welling where a canine had broken the flesh. She looked from her wrist to the boy. He was shaking. Not with anger, she realized suddenly, with pure, unadulterated terror. They weren't just dirty, they were terrified. Of her, of their father, of the world. The anger drained out of Maeve, replaced by a hollow, aching fatigue. She didn't yell. She didn't strike him. She just rubbed her wrist and walked out the back door to the woodpile. The biting cold air slapped her in the face. She leaned against the rough bark of the cabin wall, dry heaving into the weeds. Her stomach was empty, so nothing came up but bitter saliva. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, ignoring the sting of the bite mark. She gathered an armful of split logs. The wood was rough, the bark tearing at the soft skin of her forearms, leaving tiny, stinging splinters. She kicked the door open and dropped the wood by the hearth. The twins had retreated to a corner, huddled together on a pile of rags that served as a bed. Maeve knelt by the fire, using an iron poker to stir the embers. She fed kindling into the red glow, blowing softly until a flame caught. The smoke stung her eyes, making them water. She let the tears fall, blending with the soot on her cheeks. Once the fire was roaring, driving back the bitter cold of the room, she stood up. She found the water barrel. It had a thin crust of ice on top. She broke it with a tin cup and filled a heavy iron kettle, swinging it over the flames. She didn't speak to the children. She rummaged through the meager pantry, cornmeal, salt, a slab of bacon covered in a layer of greenish mold. She took a knife, carved away the rot, and sliced the meat. The sizzling fat hissed in the skillet, filling the cabin with a heavy, greasy aroma. From the corner, she heard a soft whimper. She poured boiling water over the cornmeal, mixing it into a thick, lumpy mush. She ladled it into 3 chipped wooden bowls, topping each with a slice of the fried salt pork and a spoon of the rendered fat. She set 2 bowls on the table. She didn't call them. She just took her own bowl, walked to the hearth, sat on the stone hearth rug, and began to eat. The food was bland, the meat painfully salty, but it was hot. Minutes passed. The floorboards creaked. Maeve kept her eyes on her bowl. From her peripheral vision, she saw Toby slowly approach the table. He snatched one bowl, retreating quickly to the corner. A moment later, he came back for the second. They ate with their hands, shoveling the hot mush into their mouths with desperate, animalistic speed, burning their tongues but refusing to stop. They were starving. Maeve finished her bowl. She stood, ignoring the sharp ache in her lower back, and walked over to the bucket of warm water she had set aside. She grabbed a ragged cloth, soaked it, and wrung it out. She walked toward the corner. Toby immediately scrambled in front of his sister, baring his teeth. Maeve stopped 3 feet away. She didn't reach for them. She simply tossed the warm, damp rag onto the floor between them. "Your faces are filthy," she said flatly. "Wipe them, or I'll do it, and I scrub hard." She turned her back on them and began to wash the skillet. She heard the wet slap of the rag against skin. When she finally turned around, their faces were streaked with wet mud, doing little more than moving the dirt around, but the worst of the soot was gone. Tess was staring at her. The little girl's eyes were a startling, pale blue, the exact color of the ice on the water barrel. She pulled her thumb from her mouth. "More?" she whispered. Her voice was raspy, unused. Maeve looked at the empty pot. She sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet cabin. "Tomorrow, you'll make yourselves sick if you eat more now." Tess didn't cry. She just accepted it, curling into a tight ball against her brother. When Gideon returned hours later, the cabin was warm. The floor had been swept of the worst debris. Maeve was asleep on a narrow cot near the fire, wrapped in the dog-smelling blanket. Gideon paused in the doorway, the freezing wind swirling around his massive frame. He looked at the clean pot, the swept floor, and the sleeping woman. He looked at the corner where his children slept, noticing the raw, scrubbed patches on their cheeks. He closed the door quietly, the click of the latch softer than it had been before. He didn't say a word. He just climbed the ladder to his loft, leaving her to the dark. 3 weeks bled into one another, measured only by the shrinking pile of chopped wood and the deepening snowdrifts outside. The mountains were an isolation Maeve had never fathomed. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy enough to ring in the ears. The cold was a constant predatory entity, always probing the walls of the cabin for a weakness. Maeve's hands were ruined. The soft skin she had possessed in town was gone, replaced by angry red cracks across her knuckles and calluses, thick as saddle leather on her palms. Hauling water, scrubbing clothes in near-freezing buckets, and wrestling with cast-iron cookware had stripped away any lingering illusions of girlhood. Yet, the terror of the first night had dulled into a gritty routine. The twins had stopped biting. It wasn't an instantaneous transformation born of magical maternal warmth. It was a truce born of necessity. Maeve fed them. She didn't hit them. She didn't yell when they accidentally knocked over a tin cup, though she did make them clean it up. The shift happened on a Tuesday. Toby had developed a hacking wet cough that rattled in his small chest. Gideon was gone, out on a 3-day trapping circuit deeper into the high country. Maeve had spent the afternoon boiling pine needles and wild mint she'd found drying in the rafters, forcing the bitter tea down the boy's throat. That night, Toby couldn't sleep. He tossed feverishly on the pallet. Maeve, exhausted to her bones, dragged her cot closer to their corner. She sat on the edge, the cold floor biting through her wool socks. She didn't know any lullabies. Her uncle hadn't been the singing type. The only songs she knew were the ones that drifted out of the saloon doors in Oakhaven. So, she sang one of those. Her voice was low, raspy from the dry cabin air, lacking any angelic sweetness. Oh, the whiskey is rye, and the floorboards are slick, and the devil is waiting down by the creek. It was entirely inappropriate for a 5-year-old. But the rhythm was steady, a slow, grounding cadence in the dark room. To her surprise, Tess uncurled from her brother's side, crept across the freezing floorboards, and climbed onto Maeve's lap. The little girl smelled of wood smoke and the faint, sour tang of unwashed hair, but she was warm. She buried her face into Maeve's stomach, her small hands gripping the rough fabric of Maeve's apron. Maeve froze. Her breath hitched. She had spent her life avoiding being touched, knowing that touch usually preceded a demand or a blow. Her arms hovered awkwardly in the air for a long moment. Then, slowly, with clumsy hesitation, she lowered her hands, resting them on the girl's thin back. Toby, still coughing, rolled over and rested his feverish cheek against Maeve's knee. The tight, panicked coil that had lived in Maeve's chest since the mercantile finally loosened. Just a fraction. She kept singing the tavern song, over and over, until the fire burned down to ash, and the children's breathing leveled out. When Gideon returned 2 days later, he brought the storm with him. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and bloated with snow. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the single-pane windows. Gideon burst through the door, a flurry of white snow swirling in behind him. He was covered in it, his beard iced over, his massive shoulders dusted white. He carried a dead buck over his shoulders, dropping the carcass onto the floorboards with a heavy, wet thud. The metallic smell of blood filled the room instantly, mixing with the scent of wet wool and pine. "Blizzard," Gideon grunted, slamming the door and dropping the heavy wooden bar across it. "We're sealed in. Might be a week." He stripped off his heavy coat, hanging it by the fire to thaw. Beneath the canvas, he wore a thermal shirt that clung to the thick, corded muscles of his chest and arms. He was sweating despite the cold, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. Maeve stood by the table, a paring knife in hand, peeling half-rotten potatoes. She watched him. He took up entirely too much space in the small room. The energy he brought in was raw, violent, crackling with the adrenaline of outrunning the storm. Toby and Tess were huddled by the hearth. At the sound of the dead deer hitting the floor, they had shrunk back, their eyes wide. Gideon noticed. He paused, his hands resting on his hips, breathing heavily. He looked at the twins, then at Maeve. He saw how Tess had instantly grabbed the hem of Maeve's skirt, hiding her face in the folds of the fabric. He saw how Toby stood slightly in front of Maeve, a defensive posture he had previously reserved only for his sister. A complex emotion flickered across Gideon's weathered face. It was too fast for Maeve to read confusion, relief, and something darker, like a sudden ache. He had brought a servant to keep his feral children alive. He hadn't expected them to choose her over him. "They ain't sick?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Toby had a fever. It broke yesterday," Maeve said. Her voice was steady. She surprised herself with how evenly she met his gaze. The dirty ice of his eyes locked onto hers. "You got him through it." It wasn't a question. "I did." Gideon nodded slowly. He stepped away from the door, moving toward the wash basin. I'll butcher the buck in the shed. Drag it out before it stinks up the place." As he walked past her, the space in the cabin suddenly felt agonizingly small. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the sharp, masculine tang of dried sweat and crushed pine needles. He reached for a towel resting on the edge of the table. His massive, scarred hand brushed against the back of hers. It was a fleeting contact, accidental, skin scraping against skin for no more than a second. But in the suffocating isolation of the cabin, it felt deafening. Maeve flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. Gideon stopped. He didn't pull away. He looked down at her hand, noticing the cracked, bleeding knuckles, the deep burn mark on her wrist from the stove. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath his beard. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer pity. He simply looked into her eyes, the silence stretching taut between them, vibrating with a heavy, unspoken tension. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was recognition. Two battered things recognizing the bruises on the other. "I'll fetch more wood," he muttered gruffly, breaking the gaze and turning away, his broad shoulders tense as he grabbed the deer by the antlers and dragged it out the back door into the screaming wind. Maeve stood frozen by the table, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of his rough skin still burning against her own. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something much quieter and infinitely more dangerous had just begun to shift. The blizzard did not politely pass. It stalled over the ridge for 6 unbroken days, burying the cabin up to the lower windowsills in heavy, wet snow. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced entirely by a howling white void that battered the log walls. Inside, the cabin shrank. With every passing hour, the heavy oak table, the stone hearth, and the meager floor space seemed to compress. The air grew thick with the smell of roasting venison, damp wool drying by the fire, and the sharp, acidic tang of Gideon's cheap pipe tobacco. It was a suffocating, forced intimacy. Maeve felt as though she couldn't draw a full breath without inhaling the sheer, physical mass of the man who owned the house. Gideon was entirely unsuited for idleness. He paced. He sharpened knives that were already lethal. He cleaned his Winchester rifle until the metal gleamed with oil, the metallic snick-clack of the lever action cutting through the dull roar of the wind. He was a creature of kinetic energy, trapped in a box, and the tension rolled off him in waves. Yet, he never raised his voice. Maeve noticed this with a quiet, lingering surprise. Uncle Amos had been a yeller. A dropped spoon or a drafty door would send him into a red-faced tirade. Gideon just absorbed the annoyances. When Toby, stir-crazy and restless, accidentally kicked a bucket of ash across the freshly swept floorboards, Maeve flinched, bracing for the shout. It didn't come. Gideon just put down his rifle, grabbed the broom, and swept it up without a word. The dynamic of the room was shifting, subtly but permanently. The twins had firmly attached themselves to Maeve. They sat by her feet while she mended torn socks, Tess occasionally resting her small chin on Maeve's knee. But Gideon was no longer just the looming shadow in the corner. He was watching them. On the 4th night, the wind screamed down the chimney, sending a puff of acrid smoke into the room. Maeve coughed, waving her hand in front of her face. She was sitting on the rug, a heavy wooden comb working through the terrible knots in Tess's hair. The little girl whimpered as a snag caught. "Hold still, little bird," Maeve murmured, keeping her voice low. "If we don't get the math